welcome back to the third and final part of 3 Women and a Workhouse Scandal. In 1838, the Board of Guardians for the Southwell Poor Law Union suspected that the governor, or master, of the workhouse, a man named John Fogg, was abusing his position. They reported his conduct to their governing body, the Poor Law Commission in London, which led to an inquiry by Assistant Commissioner Edward Goulson and John Fogg's forced resignation. The details of the scandal were recorded in the minutes of the Guardians' meeting on the 22nd of May. John Fogg was accused of putting a wooden log, or truancy clog, on the leg of a woman of weak intellect, in direct contravention of the Guardians' orders. He had also gone against their orders in allowing another woman to leave the workhouse. The woman was pregnant, and it was suspected that John Fogg was the father. The women are not named, and so we never get to hear their side of the story. In part 1, I uncovered the identity of the woman of weak intellect, Sarah Mountney, while in part 2, I explored the life of the second woman, Elizabeth Barnsdale. Both women had entered the workhouse following their husband's desertion. Both suffered under a poor law that penalised women for the actions of the men they depended upon. But there was a third unnamed woman involved in this scandal, Mrs. Fogg, the master's wife. Was she complicit in John Fogg's abuse of the women in her care, or was she also a victim of her husband, the man upon whom she depended? It's been difficult to discover any information about Mrs. Fogg, the workhouse matron, and yet she ought to play a central role in these events. As Edward Goulson pointed out when writing to the Poor Law Commission, John Fogg was a married man, and his wife was in the house as matron at the time the offences took place. So, we could reasonably expect Goulson to consider Mrs. Fogg guilty of, at the least, some degree of neglect of her duties. As matron, she, not John Fogg, was responsible for running the women's wards and managing the women paupers. Goulson judges John Fogg harshly, believing him to be a loose person in all his habits and an unfit man for the situation which he now holds. And yet Goulson is uncharacteristically sympathetic towards Mrs. Fogg, continuing, "I am certainly sorry for the man, and especially for his wife, who I believe to be a deserving person." Did John Fogg deserve Goulson's condemnation as a man of loose morals? Did Mrs. Fogg deserve his sympathy? And just who was the mysterious Mrs. Fogg? John was the son of James and Mary Fogg. He was baptised at St. Mary's Church in Nottingham on the 5th of August, 1792. He had 2 younger sisters, Anne and Mary, and a younger brother, Thomas. James Fogg was a silk throster, and the family lived on Sheep Lane, now Market Street. The address suggests they were not prosperous. Sheep Lane was no more than a narrow alley, a notorious spot for accidents, as there was insufficient room for carts to safely pass pedestrians, never mind other carts or horses. Because of this, it was known to locals as Blood Lane. In December 1813, when he was 21, John enlisted and served in the Napoleonic Wars with the 2nd Battalion of the 59th Regiment of Foot. The regiment was involved in the Battle of Waterloo, although they only played a peripheral role. They were tasked with blocking the main Paris to Brussels road at the village of Hal, where they succeeded in preventing the French cavalry finding a way around the flank of the British Army. Later, they led the British Army on their entry into Paris, and they remained billeted in France until December 1815, when they were sent to Ireland. John was awarded both the Waterloo Medal 1815 and the Military General Service Medal. I have not found a record of his discharge, but the 2nd Battalion was disbanded in 1816, and I found no records suggesting he served in any other regiment. John Fogg's life over the next 16 years remains a mystery. What is certain is that he answered this newspaper advertisement as he and his wife had taken up the positions of master and matron of the workhouse by April 1832. The master's journals, held at Nottinghamshire Archives, and the Poor Law Inquiry of 1832 tell us quite a lot about the Foggs' lifestyle as master and matron. The workhouse had considerable land attached to it. There was 1½ acres of garden and 8½ acres of grassland used as pasture. The garden was cultivated by the male paupers to provide food for the workhouse, and the master's journals record the plants bought to stock the garden in 1825, 2 months after the workhouse opened. With leeks, onions, potatoes, carrots and turnips, as well as other vegetables, and a quantity of fruit, the gardens were well stocked. They kept pigs, as well as 3 or 4 cows. Every year the cows were bulled, and dairy work was undertaken. The women were also kept busy spinning flax bought from Newark. In effect, John Fogg and his wife were running a small holding, with the pauper inmates as their workers. As the newspaper advertisement for the job sets out, John Fogg was paid £50 a year, just over 19 shillings a week, at least 10 shillings more than a farm labourer's weekly wage. And in addition, he had free board and accommodation. Anyone who's visited the workhouse, now a National Trust property in Southwell, will know that the master's rooms are spacious and attractive. Of course, £15 of this salary was for the matron, but would have been paid to John Fogg on her behalf. It's frustrating, because the records only ever refer to her as the matron or John Fogg's wife. We are no closer to finding out who she was. In 1836, life changed for the Foggs when the new Poor Law came into effect. The workhouse was placed at the centre of a new union of parishes, now numbering 60 as opposed to 49, and had to be run according to the rules set out in the law, as administered by the Poor Law Commission. The livestock was sold, along with some of the land, although the garden was retained and continued to be cultivated for food. The number of inmates also rose, and now included able-bodied men and women. Previously, the paupers were mainly children, the old, and the infirm. According to the evidence that John Fogg gave to the Poor Law Inquiry in 1832, there were no able-bodied men in the house at all, and only a handful of able-bodied women, all of whom had come to the workhouse in order to have their babies. From 1836, the workhouse had to admit able-bodied paupers, because they were now to be denied what was known as outdoor relief, or help from their parish, usually given in the form of money, bread, and coal. In 1837, the old parish workhouse in Southwell was closed, and more paupers transferred to the Union House and John Fogg's care. Among them was Sarah Mountney, the Woman of Weak Intellect. Elizabeth Barnsdale also returned to the workhouse with her 2 sons, Edward and Richard. Richard had been born in the workhouse 2 years earlier, and it was in November of 1837 that Fogg gave Elizabeth permission to go to Newark Fair, where she stayed away for the night, allegedly with Mrs. Fogg's permission, and conceived a child. Over the next 6 months, the Guardians began to have concerns about John Fogg's behaviour. They believed he gave Elizabeth Barnsdale preferential treatment, and when her pregnancy was known, it was rumoured that John Fogg was the father. He had also begun to disobey their orders. He had put the truancy clog on Sarah Mountney's leg, and he seems to have smuggled Elizabeth Barnsdale out of the workhouse the day before the Guardians' meeting, when they wished to question her about her pregnancy. John Fogg's behaviour is highly suspicious and tends to point to his guilt in this affair, although he always maintained his innocence. But what strikes me as odd is the lack of any reference to questions being directed towards Mrs. Fogg, and any suggestion she might have some culpability, especially given that the women paupers were directly under her management. Edward Goulson was absolutely certain that John Fogg was the father of Elizabeth's baby, but he couldn't prove it, and will probably never know the truth. Instead, John Fogg was forced to resign on the grounds of his disregard for the Guardian's instructions. We do have Fogg's own account in some letters he later wrote to the Poor Law Commission. He continued to deny any abuse of Elizabeth Barnsdale, and he appeared to have the support of the Guardians. Gentlemen, a report was prevalent that the girl who was in the kitchen of the Southwell Union Workhouse was in the family way by me, and inquiry was made, and it was proved to be false. I was next accused of putting a log on a lunatic's leg. I must say I did. John Fogg went on to explain that the truancy clog was a necessary, temporary measure, the only means to keep Sarah Mountney safe while alterations to the wall were carried out that would prevent her escaping in the future. He was confident that his innocence with regard to Elizabeth Barnsdale was accepted, and his only wrongdoing was his failure to obey the Guardian's orders in regard to the truancy clog. And for this only I am dismissed from my situation as Governor of the Workhouse. A few weeks later, John Fogg sent the Poor Law Commission a testimonial, signed by 47 of the Guardians, and asking that the couple be allowed to apply for the position of master and matron of another workhouse, they having been good and most faithful servants, and much respected by us. This testimonial was accompanied by another from the workhouse medical officer. Having known Mr. Fogg for the space of nearly 7 years as master of the Southwell Workhouse, I can conscientiously bear my testimony to his kindness and humanity to the poor under his charge. Despite these glowing character references, the Poor Law Commission refused to allow John Fogg to apply for any position as an officer of the Poor Law. This was a serious blow to his career ambitions. When he left Southwell, John Fogg returned to Nottingham, where he remained until the 13th of March, 1840, the date of the last letter that he wrote to the Poor Law Commission. After that, he moved to London, where he set himself up as an ironmonger. And it is here, for the very first time, that we learn Mrs. Fogg's name from the 1841 census return for Camberwell. She was Amelia Fogg, and interestingly, a woman born in foreign parts. The new ironmonger's business was a failure. John Fogg appears in the bankruptcy notices of the newspapers in 1843, by which time he is living in Welbeck Street, Marylebone, and working as a house porter. And that is where we find the couple on the 1851 census return, at number 77 Welbeck Street, the Marylebone Dispensary. The head of the household is a surgeon, Henry Matthews. John is described as a porter born in Nottingham, while Amelia is a house servant born in Brussels. Once Amelia's name was revealed, it was possible to discover a little more about her. I haven't found a record of her marriage, but she and John Fogg had a son, James John, who was born on 10th of July 1816 and baptised at St Margaret's in Westminster in March 1818. And so I wonder, did John Fogg meet Amelia while he was a serving soldier in Belgium and France in the Napoleonic Wars, and did they marry abroad? Could this be the explanation of why Amelia was never held accountable for the mistreatment of Sarah Mountney and Elizabeth Barnsdale, women technically in her care? If she was living in a foreign country, possibly with poor English, Amelia may have been even more dependent upon her husband than the women paupers were on theirs. I haven't found a record of Amelia's death. John Fogg died in 1856 of apoplexy. If Amelia survived him, I am really glad that she had family living nearby with whom she was able to seek refuge. Her son James and his family were also living in Marylebone. They named their youngest child Amelia. 3 Women and a Workhouse Scandal is part of the Friends of Nottinghamshire Archives Phonobite series, all of which can be found on our YouTube channel. Thank you for joining me. I hope you found it interesting. If you'd like to know more about Friends of Nottinghamshire Archives, do visit our website or follow us on Facebook.